for creating of the federal government and what the federal government can do on federal lands called seat and places purchased, and how they go about putting together their judicial system, which is in Article 3. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. So Section 1, the judicial power of the United States, okay, that's the federal delegates and at the seat of government. When it says United States, it's talking about the federal government, what the federal government can do. Okay, the delegates can do this at the seat of government. It sets up a judicial power, P, power. Power, when it's capitalized like this, it means only the powers within the Constitution. It shows ownership. It's a proper noun. I went over this in my last video. I'm going to go over it again today. Chambers Etymological Dictionary. An etymological dictionary shows the origin of the words, the date, who used it first. Like this was a tale of a tub in 1704 for this citation. And was first used in 1300, came from Old French and also from Latin. Okay, proper, like a proper noun, means one's own, in which property, a noun, also means one's own. From Latin, proprius. Okay, Latin, proprius, one's own. Okay, so proper and property, same thing. The property, which is the specific powers listed in the Constitution, are given to the United States for its judicial purposes, is invested in one Supreme Court. Now, I want you to look at the capitalization on this because it's important that you note that one is not capitalized and supreme is not capitalized. This means that there's only one of them. It's the Supreme Court, meaning it's the highest court of appeals. Okay, it doesn't mean this is supreme over all the courts of the country in all of the states and everywhere else. That's not what it means. This is not a title. The name is not written as a title. If it were written as a title, it would look like this: one Supreme Court. It is not. It simply means there's only one of them. It's the highest court for the federal government's use in exercising its federal powers, and the power is invested in the court. It does not say that the power is vested in the judges. It's vested in the court, which means that the judges have to follow the law. They can't give their opinion. They have to just follow the law. It's not an opinion court. I put this here because I want you to see that it's not, there's no S on the end. Okay, the judges cannot make things up. I've got a book called The Constitutional Law as Fiction, and it's by a man named LaRue, who I believe he said he graduated Harvard, and when he went to work in Louisiana, he did a lot of cases for the colored people in that area, or the people of color, and he learned from them that there's a lot of color of law going on when the Constitution is applied to justice and how the judges do it. And so in the book, he teaches you how to look at things and how to decide, and sometimes it's not that easy, whether the court is issuing a subjective opinion or whether they're issuing a objective fact. Okay, so the power is not vested in the judges. The power is vested in the court, which means the courts have to follow the law. They don't do that, and they haven't done that since the beginning. Okay, and then it has the Supreme Court and inferior courts. Okay, so these inferior courts are created by Congress from time to time, and they're not supposed to be in session all the time. They're only supposed to be in session when they're needed. And when there's an appeal, it goes to this Supreme Court. So the idea of having this being called supreme, it should really look like, or it could look like, a single appeals court, or a higher court. But I think what the founders were doing when they wrote this is they wanted to make sure that they limited the federal government, and they made sure that the federal government understood that they couldn't have a whole bunch of Supreme Courts. They couldn't set them all around the country, and they couldn't make a whole bunch of franchises of them and call them the Supreme Courts or a Supreme Court with franchises. So they wanted everyone to understand that there was going to be only one appeals court. There's not going to be appeal after appeal after appeal after appeal. Okay, because I think it's in England, they have several different types of appeals court: a King's Bench, a court of chancery, and then another court where you can pay some money and have it heard again. And they didn't want that. They wanted, you got an inferior court, and then you had the appeals court, and that's it. And these are for use just by the federal government and the federal officers and federal employees when they had issues on the federal lands, because that's where the federal jurisdiction is. The federal government has authority only on federal lands. And they tell you that in the laws that they wrote, and it's here in the Constitution. The problem is most people just don't know how to read the Constitution. Okay, so the judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties. And then it says citizens of another state, between citizens of different states, between citizens of the same state, claiming land grants of different. Okay, so people interpret this part of the Constitution to mean that the Constitution has jurisdiction over citizens, any citizen of any state, as long as they meet these requirements. It's different states, another state, land grants. Okay, so I don't believe that's what they're talking about here, because when you became in the Eisenhower reports, he explains, and it's not Eisenhower, it's a commission that was put together, and this commission was a group of people who contacted the attorney generals of each of the states, and they submitted all their jurisdiction paperwork. And what the report found, based on the information from the attorneys general, was that the federal government had federal lands in each of the states, and on those federal lands were federal citizens. So you have to forget about all the amendments made after the Civil War or during the Civil War, because during the Civil War was a coup. There should never have been a civil war, because you can't have a civil war between sovereign states ran by the federal government. That was explained by an attorney on a video, and we can talk more about that at another time. But the point I want to make here is that there are citizens on the federal lands. All of the combined federal lands in one state are as if it were a state. And really, they should have been called provinces. The provinces of the federal government, I guess. But I know there's a section in here where people point me to where they say a state cannot be created within a state. But I think if you really look at all the information in the Constitution, what it's saying is that an independent state cannot become an independent state, or an independent state cannot, a dependent state cannot become an independent state inside a state. So they're sort of using the word state interchangeably with federal area. So state and federal area in the Constitution, they kind of mean the same thing, and you can't really tell what they're saying. And I think this is part of what they mean when they say that the Constitution is a vague document. And maxim of law states that vague documents allow for fraud and allow for injury to occur. And that's why you don't make vague documents. But the way it uses state inside the Constitution is vague, because there are federal lands in each of the states, and those federal lands are dependent areas, not independent. They cannot become free, sovereign, and independent states. They cannot become sovereign states because they are federal lands, and the federal lands were ceded to the federal government only for certain purposes, which is to do the things that are listed in the Constitution on those federal lands. And I'm talking about this again because there are people who have watched all of my videos and still don't understand what I'm saying. And I'm not sure how I can explain it any differently. I've shown maps, and I've shown the Constitution, and I've shown, that there's a difference between the federal citizen and the state citizen. And I think because of Lincoln's coup, and most people don't realize that it was a coup, and they don't realize what Lincoln did, that they don't see what was before Lincoln to compare it to what was after Lincoln. They only see what came after Lincoln. And what came after Lincoln was that everyone is a citizen of the United States. But before Lincoln, that was not the case. If you wanted to be a federal citizen and work for the federal government, you had to apply in a court of record to become a citizen of the United States. And you had to live and work on the federal land. And when you did that, it started your time to go to work at the seat of government. So like for representatives, it had to be 7 years, I think. And for senators, it had to be 9 years. And then for the president, it had to be 14 years. So you had to become a documented citizen of the United States, living and working on federal lands, having a loyalty to the federal government for a number of years before you could go to the seat of government and represent the states as United States. So here, I believe that because the federal government only has jurisdiction on federal lands, when it's talking about these citizens, it's talking about the citizens on the federal lands, and the land grants are the lands given to or ceded to or sold to the federal government for building military forts. Okay, and that's in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. So the citizens were the citizens on the federal lands, but you had also citizens that were private citizens who owned lands that were sold to the federal government. And these private citizens then, even though they didn't work for the federal government, they became federal citizens. And there's a lot of things written about this in different government reports and writings and journals and debates and stuff on whether or not those people had voting rights, whether or not they were federal citizens, whether or not they were considered this, that, or the other when it came to the federal government, whether they came under federal crimes and stuff. So again, there were people who owned, you know how it works when the federal government wants to buy public property or private property for public use. Some people owned the lands, and they had the like allodial title, patents, and that stuff to those lands, because we're talking about something that happened in the 1700s to the 1850s, when the federal government was still bringing states into the union, and the states, as part of the equal sharing in for defense purposes, granted lands to the federal government for building the forts. So on some of those lands, there were private citizens, and they didn't want to sell their lands. I believe, for example, if the person who told me this was correct, there's a place at Fort Leavenworth where part of Fort Leavenworth is owned by a private family, and they're surrounded by federal lands. And so they had to build a road off the federal lands so that these people could come on and get off the federal lands. Okay, so once they purchased those lands, or purchased all the area around those lands, they had to figure out, what do we do with these private citizens? Do they become federal citizens? Are they still citizens of the state? Do they pay federal taxes and state taxes? Are they allowed federal privileges? Are they allowed federal rights? Do they vote? Do they not vote? So when it's talking about citizens of the same state, it may be talking about, for example, the federal government and private people living on federal land who own some of those lands, considered different states, and between state or the citizens thereof. So which state is it talking about? And foreign states. So then you have people off federal lands who weren't part of the federal government, but they were arguing with the federal government over who owned those lands. Okay. Now, what it's saying is that those people have to use the federal courts. That the federal government is going to decide who owns the land. Okay, so this is sort of a little odd to me, because in Texas v. White, it was obvious that there were a lot of lands that were not ever ceded to the federal government, but because the state, Texas, had to go and argue with the federal government over those lands, the federal government saw fit to rule in its own favor and give itself the right over those lands. And of course, that was after Lincoln. So after Lincoln's coup, basically the federal government claimed ownership over the whole country, and it was never given ownership over the whole country. And we know this because it says it in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, which I talk about in almost every single one of my videos. The district was called the seat of government, and then it had places purchased by consent of the state, and it promised that when it purchased those lands that it would go by this contract. So you can have a contract if you go and you buy a house, or you buy, let's say you buy 1,000 acres, and the owner can say, well, we're going to sell you the mineral rights, or we're not going to sell you the mineral rights. So this is basically the federal government saying, if you sell us lands, this is what we're going to do on the lands that we buy from you. So places purchased. Okay, now I think the reason why it says places purchased instead of lands purchased is because there were some forts already built when the states institutionalized the United States for defense purposes. And so then the federal government could come in and buy those places and continue building the forts. So when it says here, the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, all of these are for defense purposes, defense with the sea, and defense with the sea means to fortify in the law of nations. Okay, so And here's the law of nations mentioned as far as piracies, felonies on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations. Okay. Keeping the trade routes to keep the trade routes open and to keep to be able to punish people when they try to attack you. Okay, so because if you're attacked on your land or in your in your right to do a thing. So if you are a country and you're traveling through the trade routes and someone comes and attacks you, then you have a right to bring them into your court. Just like if someone came onto my private property, I should have a right to bring them into my court, which would be the state court or a natural law court or common law court created by the people. So the federal government is saying that they want the right to punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations whenever they are in their right of traveling through the trade routes. Okay, so there's two places. There's the seat of government and places purchased, which are the military areas. And the inferior courts are on those lands, or supposed to be on those lands. And then the superior court is up at the seat of government. So you have the inferior courts built at the places purchased because you had people there, and those people had a right to have a judicial process. The federal citizens had a right to a judicial process, and that would be in inferior courts. And if there was an issue and it had to be appealed, then they would go to the District of Columbia, to the Supreme Court, which is just an appeals court. And that's what this is saying. Okay, so let's see, there's something else I wanted to look at. Let's see. Okay, so whenever someone commits a crime on federal lands, it's a federal crime and they use the federal courts. When someone commits a crime in the state, they use state courts, and that makes a lot of sense. So what if, let's pretend like it's 1850 and Lincoln had not performed his coup yet. If you were a federal citizen and you came off the federal lands and you committed a crime on the state lands, you would have to go into a state court, even though you were a federal citizen. If you are a state citizen and for some purpose you go onto federal lands and you commit a crime, then you use the federal courts. And that's what jurisdiction is. Somebody had mentioned to me that they thought that jurisdiction had about 16 different meanings. Well, basically there's one meaning, and that's the right to do a thing. It's your right or power to do a thing. Okay, and whatever that thing is, it should be documented so that other people know that you have the right to do that thing. And this is what the Constitution is. The Constitution is the right to do those things listed in here at the seat of government and the places purchased. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Because so many people believe that they're a citizen, a federal citizen, a citizen of the United States, and they're not. Lincoln confused the situation when he came in and took over the states and decided that the states belonged to the federal government, and the federal government created the states where they did not. And I think that's where a lot of confusion comes in, because Lincoln allowed for an amendment which made federal citizens also state citizens, which is just simply not the case. Okay, and there's a whole history on that, and I'll be doing more videos on that as well as many other things. Okay, so here's your video on the judicial system, federal judicial system, and the supreme law of the land is the supreme law of the federal lands being seat of government and places purchased. Okay, so you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.